before I get started, before it drifts out of my mind, so you mentioned you were a meteorologist.
Yes.
An interesting and unusual word. I mean, just for my own curiosity, I was going to search that word beforehand to get a
Oh.
definition of it. So I've gone on the Merriam-Webster website. So I mean, I hope you don't mind. I'm just going to do this for a few moments, borrowing 46 people's time so that I can search that. Just one caveat to this, actually. If you can help me, James, I want to do this without sharing any of my personal data with Merriam-Webster. So I guess to start with, we've got this little thing has appeared here. So it says manage your privacy. What do you reckon? Is this
Can
an
you close that
acceptable
box?
situation?
Is there a
Uh,
close? Can you
there
close
is
that?
no close button, I'm
Oh,
afraid.
no.
We have an accept all or a manage settings.
Yeah. Try manage settings then. Yeah,
We'll
let's try that
manage
one.
those settings. All right, so we have
Oh, you.
nothing pre-checked. Like a
Okay.
whole lot of things opted out here. Do you think we're good?
I don't know. Vendors. What's on the other tab there where it says
Oh,
vendors?
vendors, vendors.
Yeah.
Yeah, a lot of things opted
Okay.
out.
I
Seems
think we must
fine.
be good. Yeah, that's it.
Must be good. Okay.
Save and
I mean,
exit. Don't click on
save
accept.
and exit.
Oh, I don't know.
Not accept all. Oh, let's
Oh,
let's just dig under a few stones here. But so store and access information. If we go on this little drop
okay.
down, okay, seems fine. Doesn't look like there's anything else there. What about personalized ads, content, measurement, audience? So we've got a little drop down here. Okay, a lot more things which are unchecked. All good, right? Unless we click here. Oh dear. All right. So
Uh,
we've not consented, so that's default opt out. But if we look at legitimate interest, we've got this one. So we'll just have to opt out here. And then if we press back, uh, so okay, it's put us back 2 stages. So we go forward again once, then we go forward again, and the 1, 2 down. Okay, we've got to opt out of that for legitimate interest, and I guess this just keeps going. So I mean, imagining that we'd done that times 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 times, James, do you think we're good?
I
Do we save and exit at that point?
I have a feeling that there might be more in there. So
You'd be
we have to
right.
use another website, I think.
We unfortunately the vendors that you mentioned before, which includes I think around about 500, 600 different things, all of them that have this little I here may use legitimate interest. So we have to also go into each vendor individually, click the drop down, uncheck legitimate interest, which it looks like about, I don't know, 30, 40% of them are doing this. So times say 200, it might take us about half an hour to get through this website without sharing any personal data with Merriam-Webster. So I hope you don't mind, James, but I'm going to stay
Should I just tell
forever
you
in
what a
the dark.
meteorologist is? Would that just
I
help? I think
I'm going to
maybe, and then
prefer
we
to
can move.
imagine that it's making beautiful sandwiches. No,
No, it's
no.
look. Here's my. Oh, you can't really
Yeah,
see it on my. The weather. It's
the
weather.
weather. Yes.
Yeah, look. There we are. That's what I do.
Yeah.
On with your
Excellent.
talk.
Yeah, I think we
I'm gonna
need
put
one of
my.
them for the background of the data science summer schools, which shows a palm tree and coconuts. Whereas when I look out of my window, what I see is rain and grey. Um, but yeah, so thank you for putting up with my slightly verbose introduction to this. But you can see this is sort of relevant to the topic that we're talking about. The presentation is called legitimately interesting. So what I'm investigating specifically here is what happens under that situation. Um, Essentially, when we look to understand what people mean when they hear about GDPR, when they think about data protection in a European context, our entire history of that as at least sort of end users, as lay people who are using the internet, has been punctuated by this experience of consent notices, consent banners since 2018, things saying that, do we consent to our data being used to personalize, to track? And it sort of lent itself to this perspective that data collection, data processing is based on consent, where in fact that happens to be kind of a misconception. Many of you here, I'm appreciating this is probably an audience of people who are quite into data and data protection. There are multiple legal bases under the GDPR. We might have something which is relating to the performance of a contract. But in this instance, we're isolating two of them: consent and legitimate interest. Legitimate interest being this kind of final one, which is much more nebulous, and understanding what happens under these two. The reason why those two have been selected is that they are the two which are most commonly presented when you're looking at websites online or engaging with applications. That's sort of standard thing we would have when using a digital service. For a bit of context, I study at the Oxford Internet Institute. It's one of the youngest departments at the University of Oxford. If you are interested in seeing me regularly not update my Twitter/X, it hurts a little bit to say that one, it is at @RealBenGilburt with a U. There does happen to be an @RealBenGilburt with an E. I followed him. He didn't follow me back. Research questions relating to this question. I'll just say also one other thing. If anyone has questions throughout, do feel free to put them in. James will be managing those. If it's something which we feel as though is relevant at that moment, at the slide that we're on, we'll pause and answer them. Otherwise, we'll sort of save them to the end. So two primary research questions which come out of this observation that we've seen. The first is, how prevalent is the invocation of consent and/or legitimate interest as a basis for processing? So what we're asking there is, how frequently do we see it? How frequently does it appear to exist from a terms and conditions perspective? The second question is, under each of those bases, to what extent is data collected? So it may be that not all websites are using legitimate interest. It may be that some of them don't even use consent. But under all of these different conditions, what happens to you from a data privacy perspective? So going for a little bit of history, sort of asking, what do we already know in the area? So legitimate interest is a concept which, or legitimate interest and consent relating to privacy, are concepts which have existed for quite some time. This is by no means the absolute start of the history of sort of consent data sharing type things. But a good foundation of sort of the modern legislative context comes from something which we call the FIPS. It's the, I should remember this acronym off the top of my head, the Fairness and Information Processing Principles. I may be getting that slightly wrong, but in 1974, which had some sort of specific descriptions in there. What they were saying is that there must be a way for a person to prevent data being shared or being used for purposes other than that for which the data subject has consented to. In that instance, we don't see any instance of legitimate interest, which may in fact be, if we think of it, sort of something which could be potentially more beneficial to us as data subjects. If it's basing everything on consent, if they're saying that a different purpose means that you need to obtain consent again, then we don't have this risk of legitimate interest sort of creeping in there. Going through into the 1980s, we sort of see what came from the OECD. Theirs talks about this idea of a vital interest, so that a certain degree of processing can take place if it happens to be a vital interest. Not too much description around what that is specifically. The Council of Europe in 1981 said that processing can take place outside of consent if it's serving the legitimate interests of a data controller. The sort of prevailing theme under these is, it doesn't really describe in too much detail what is a vital interest, what is a legitimate interest. And we can imagine that a lot of things would constitute vital or legitimate interest. Looking at this paper here, I'm afraid I didn't put the accent in, but Cormier and Greg Taylor in 2020 essentially boils down to, I think, the expected answer of all else being equal, more data typically equals more profit. That data makes each customer that an organization is interacting with more profitable to them, and that they're generally more able to extract that value more easily. They know how to target that person, how to interact with that person in order to make the maximum amount of sales, or to make the maximum sales with the least amount of expensive effort going into that. We can extend that as well to know that we have things like shareholder value. which is typically a business imperative, which again, you could see as being a legitimate interest. I'd caveat that ever so slightly by saying that, in my view, and I did a bit of digging around this a year or so back, but I personally think that idea of shareholder value is a bit narrow. Shareholders can value a great many things which aren't purely a share price increasing. A shareholder might value the environment, might value inclusivity. And if the majority of shareholders believe that that should be shareholder value too, I am the exception here. The way this is typically, if not universally interpreted, is that shareholder value means you must increase your share price at virtually all costs, providing you're not breaking the law in other ways. So then, going into the kind of present day context, we have the GDPR. I think we've been virtually unable to ignore that with all of the notices since 2018. But the GDPR expands on both what we expect from consent and legitimate interest. So consent described in Article 4, Part 11. I don't know how you describe that, but it's sort of number 11 in Article 4. That consent should be freely given, specific, informed, and unambiguous. We get the sort of biggest expansion within the document there in recital 32, which excludes things like silence, pre-check boxes, or inactability. I've got a typo there, or an inaction, basically. And legitimate interest is described in Article 21. The main thing that we see here, notably there's less in it, we have a right to object. The shared thing that we have there, which we kind of understand through the statements in Articles 13 and 14, is that both have a right to be informed. There are many more shared rights than this. These are the ones which are kind of relevant to what we're investigating here. But what we find from these is that we expect this kind of difference. Legitimate interest gives us only the right to object. So we therefore expect what we saw in the case of Merriam-Webster. We expect that we will have a pre-checked toggle by default with which we take an action to opt out. With consent, especially through the expansion of recital 32, silence doesn't count, so a pre-checked box doesn't count. We expect an unchecked box, which only becomes accepted through an action being taken. The strange situation that we have, though, is that they seem to be happening for the same purposes. When we looked at the Merriam-Webster website, when we started to go into those personalization things, we essentially have consent and legitimate interest next to each other for something like tracking, geolocation, personalization. So what does that mean? Does it mean that if I've not accepted, is the data still being used simply because I didn't know or didn't take the time to object to that self-same purpose? We do have some expansions on this. So three notable ones. We sort of understand expansions of these definitions through court cases. The expansions become particularly forceful if the European Court of Justice, the ECJ, has provided an opinion on these cases. Reason being that if they do, it becomes sort of forceful throughout the European Union. Cases which haven't had an ECJ opinion tend to be impactful only for that specific geography. Also a slight detour here, but it's kind of relevant to say as well that this generally has an impact on the UK. So as much as the UK has left the EU, what happened was that we sort of copied the GDPR's law. We call it UK GDPR. There is the potential that in the future it would become more different from the European, the EU version of GDPR. Right now, it's pretty much the same. But some of these things, as we get further away, we might start to see more differences. But so three cases that are quite relevant to this. We had one from Orange, Romania versus the ANSP-DCP. I think that is the Dutch Data Protection Authority, if I'm remembering correct. I can't remember exactly. But between Orange, the telecommunications company we're used to, and a data protection authority in a company similar to the ICO in the UK or CNIL in France. So what happened here is that the people signing up for new mobile contracts they were opted in when they applied for a new contract with Orange Romania, arguing that they had provided their consent when they agreed to it for obtaining that contract. The ECJ's ruling, so it has that sort of normative EU-wide force, was that consent wasn't freely given because the data subject didn't have a legitimate choice. That if they were to, the only way of rejecting that was to essentially say, well, I'm not going to take the contract. So that was determined within a consent context, that consent was not freely given. It's sort of non-impactful for legitimate interests, but it does mean that sort of bundling these terms with something essential to be able to provide the service, if that data is not essential for the performance of the service, the performance of the contract, is not lawful. Other cases that we see that are relevant, there's Max Schrems's case, Schrems 1 and 2. These cases are much more important for different reasons as well outside of this, but an element of it provided some clarity to this case as well. So it's kind of got things which relate to the informed aspect of a consent right, the sort of right to be informed that we have there. So it was arguing that information needs to be accessible, understandable, and comprehensive, again, in a consent context. The third one that we have is quite interesting. It's the Planet 49 case. So Planet 49 was a company that was basically running some kind of like an online lottery. I think you had to put your email in and you had a chance of winning an Apple Mac laptop or something along those lines. But what they did was have two boxes. One was pre-checked, one wasn't pre-checked. One was asking if you agreed to tracking and personalization. One was basically the one to agree that you were going to be in the competition. The pre-checked one was for personalization, and the unchecked one was the one that you needed to check. So you basically needed to press both. You needed to uncheck personalization and check the other one to be able to be in the lottery without having shared personal data. The clear thing there is it's in breach of our Recital 32. It's silence or a pre-check box isn't something that we allow. The part where this gets interesting is that it referred out to a few other laws as well. So there's EU 2016 679, which don't worry about those. Subsequent revisions to these as well. So it relates as well to the Privacy and Electronic Communications Directive. But this particular law talked about the sort of right to refuse storage of cookies, that you should have the right to refuse based on your consent. Again, this appears to focus on consent, but where we get the kind of deviation from what we've been discussing in a GDPR context here is that it's saying that cookies should be based on consent. What we have right now is that GDPR isn't a cookie law. GDPR is a data law, and it's not focusing on cookies. If we were to look at the earlier law, we would instead argue that, well, because they're cookies, we need to ask for consent. Therefore, because we're asking for consent, it needs to be default opt-out. There are sort of a few different ways that these laws could work with each other. So to use some annoying Latin, you have the principle of lex posterior derogat lexi priori. I don't know how accurate my pronunciation was that, but what that means in English is that the latter law, i.e. the GDPR, which was came into force in 2018, repeals the earlier 2002 law. So GDPR would be the forceful law, therefore we go by GDPR. Therefore, it's fine. We can do it doesn't impact our interpretation of legitimate interest. The second, though, is lex specialis. That's positing that the more specific rule takes precedence over the more general. I think the clue here is kind of in the name, that the GDPR is quite general. It's the General Data Protection Regulation. And at least on this specific clause, it would appear that the earlier law is more specific. So we might be able to say, in other instances, we default to the GDPR, but in this more specific instance, we use the earlier law. Therefore, cookies specifically aren't something which we use legitimate interest for. So That's not how it was interpreted. I should say it's just a potential way that it may be interpreted if you're sort of exploring different avenues of how these laws may coexist. But the sort of hanging question here is, if we ask ourselves, do we notice anything about these three cases, is that other than for me making an attempt to find some parallels that we can draw with legitimate interest, all of these court cases focus either entirely or in the most part on consent. We don't really have any expansions on legitimate interest, which kind of raises a bit of a concern. We start to wonder, how well protected are we? How much interest has been forced on this? How good are the definitions when we compare this to the hundreds or thousands of pages that help us to expand what consent means, what informed means, what freely given means in a consent context? We have none of that for legitimate interest. We're still stuck in that place of, well, provided it's in the legitimate interest of the data controller or processor, and it doesn't conflict with fundamental rights or human rights of the data subject, then anything goes virtually. So there's my slight giveaway there. It's all in a consent context. So what we then start to wonder is, what does this mean? So we start to see there is this kind of oversight happening from a policy or legislative context. Do we know what's actually happening when we look into this? Do we know how much data is collected and processed under a consent basis? Do we know how much is shared under a legitimate interest basis? What happens in combination? So we have some research on sort of related areas as well. So these four papers are the most relevant. So we've got one from the Centre for Data Ethics and Innovation. They're essentially a UK government team which provides advice. Used to be DCMS. They've sort of shifted where they're providing their advisory into, but it often impacts UK policy directions. But their paper, Active Online Choices, looked at how people would engage with these, what I tend to term consent management tools, appreciating that in itself is a slightly weird name to call it, because we're talking about both our ability to configure consent and our ability to configure legitimate interest preferences. But consent management is the sort of industry accepted term. So they ran an experiment where they were looking at how different people are able to configure these. So it was looking at something which they termed task accuracy, sort of giving them a consent management tool and a fictional persona saying, you're someone that wants to share no data, you're someone who wants to share all data, you're someone who wants to share data only for these reasons. They were asked to to configure the tool based on those preferences. And the sort of results show that of the various designs, people aren't really very good at doing it. There are some potential permeations of design which make people more effective. What we notice, however, is that all of the designs that were presented to people only offered consent toggles. Not a single one included legitimate interest objection toggles. We have Ofcom, again, a sort of UK government function, 2021, published a report on adults' media use and attitudes. There's asked this question, it's sort of a subset within the paper, asking if people understand all the ways in which their data is shared. Again, it had some strange omissions in there. There are many other ways that data could be collected and processed other than those that they were confirming, despite the fact that they were saying all ways in which data was collected. And it made absolutely no mention to legitimate interest again. So the two following papers come outside of a government context. We have this one of uninformed consent, studying GDPR notices in the field. So this is looking at the consent managing tools, looking at how changes to the design can impact people's ability to configure them. Again, it doesn't look at any instances of legitimate interest toggles being there. Final paper being from Sanchez Rola in 2019 called Can I Opt Out Yet? Again, made no reference to legitimate interest in the question of whether or not people are able to opt out. Though the interesting thing which this paper found was that when they had opted out, well, despite the fact that there seemed to be a decrease in the amount of data collected, 92% of websites were still performing some form of tracking even when users hadn't consented. It kind of gives us this floating question of, maybe this is happening because of legitimate interest and you have to also object. The thing we notice a second time is that nobody has referred to legitimate interest. We kind of have this situation where I think the best way we could describe it is sort of the silence is deafening. That there's almost this sort of pregnant pause, and that the fact that people aren't talking about it is in itself the concern. That in sort of expert audiences of people who are researching privacy and consent or preference configuration of these, people aren't thinking about legitimate interest. In the government teams, despite these being good papers, it also has an oversight there. And if we are to say that there's a relatively similar potential, it may be that the extent is less, but it's a similar potential for erosion of privacy interests from both consent and legitimate interest, we may be concerned. We may be concerned that we are losing our rights. We may be worried that we're losing those protections that we want because we're putting all of our focus on consent and no focus on legitimate interest. So that is what I have gone out to understand. So how did I go about this? So this is a very reductionist slide to boil down, which I mean, for context, this whole thing is my my MSc thesis. There's about 30 or 40 pages dedicated to this methodology. I won't go through all of them in excruciating detail, just that I think the most important footnotes. But the things that we had to figure out with this is, so what do we want to measure? How do we want to measure it? What are some other interesting variables that we find within this? So everything that I've tried to do from an experimental basis is optimizing based on three different things. So one is making it representative of real world behaviors. So where people normally go, how they normally interact with those services. Making the data accurate and complete. So trying as much to be exhaustive. And then the third one is making it viable. Problem being that, you know, if you try to see how the entire internet works, it might take you the entirety of all time to get that far. Exaggerating slightly there, but it would take an awfully long time. So these sort of early considerations of what do we want to do? What do we want to survey? So looking for the services, the sort of list of services that I selected was the Alexa Web Rankings top global websites. You would find now, if you're trying to repeat something like this, that the Alexa Web Ranking service no longer exists, essentially. But it did exist up to the time when I began this project, and even when they stopped, they were still publishing the updated lists for a few more months. So it gives a good list, and it seems to be based on the most valuable signals to this project. It's calculating it based on how many unique monthly visitors it gets, how many pages per visit do people look at there. If you're looking at a similar thing, SimilarWeb is the service which looks to overtake its place. The reason why I didn't use them is they seem to use some other statistics or some other pieces of data which have less clear relevance to this project. Things like dwell time on a website. It's not clear that your dwell time increases the amount of data that's being collected, nor something like bounce rate. You're going on to a different website. Outside of that may be relevant to a tracker, but it's difficult to measure. So we went for the Alexa Web Rankings, and also went for websites. So the big alternative to this is looking at data collection through apps. I do think that would be an interesting one to run. The reason why I didn't go with apps is that it's pretty equal between the two on engagement now. We do find that there is a higher degree of mobile app usage than desktop web usage, but you have this sort of weird crossover in statistics in that mobile browsers are an app, so that's effectively website usage. The thing which really tips it is on the viability side, that when we look at websites, we get these consent management tools that allow us to configure both consent and legitimate interest in all sorts of different ways. Apps don't tend to offer us that. They're more often managed by the mobile operating system, but it's not based on the sort of bases for processing. It's those things coming up when you're on your iPhone or on an Android phone, and it says, do you give this app permission to access storage, something like that. So it's much more interesting to use websites from this sort of experimental basis. What I looked to measure were cookies. There are alternatives to this. The big ones being things like local or session storage. Using cookies seems to be currently the most representative behavior. Virtually all websites are using this for personalization. It's something which we can also measure quite viably. it does appear that there may be a change to this in the future. The European Union sort of policymakers have been discussing that they want to get away from cookies, they want to get away from consent management tools, and they instead want to make it this sort of on a what's the correct word, but a voluntary basis that companies would be doing this based on browser preferences. Google has been pushing for this as well. Google's been pushing for it for a few years. People haven't taken it on. It's just not happening yet. The concern that I would have with that is it could potentially be very good. It could be very good if we're able to configure things on a browser level to say, every website I visit, I don't want to share my data. I don't want personalization and targeting. The caveat to this is, well, that may not be what we find. It may be that we're offered the ability to only configure our consent, but legitimate interest ends up even more hidden. It may be even more hidden than that ridiculous, potential half hour that I was showing with James at the start of trying to configure things on the Merriam-Webster website. So, pros and cons there. Looking at this measurement as well, I won't go through it exhaustively, but as much as possible, this process has been automated. So what I've used is the Playwright browser. It's a product from Microsoft. Broadly overtakes things like Selenium, which has been used for web testing before. But what I do is feed it a list of websites. I tell it what I want it to do. I tell it if I want it to be consenting or not consenting on the consent basis. If it's configuring legitimate interest due to the how complicated those notices are, it just pauses and I configure it and then it continues. But it will go through to that website. Where possible, it will configure consent. Where impossible, I will do the configuration myself. Then what it does is proceeds to look at 5 additional pages on that website. So it's running something we call a crawler, looks at that first web page, builds a list of hyperlinks, selects at random 5 of those links and loads them up as well. Each time we're taking a snapshot of how many cookies are installed on the browser. When that's completed, we have a big JSON file. We run that through a parser, and that parser takes away any duplicates. Reason that we're doing that is that it doesn't actually work like, initially I thought it would be kind of like a snowball, that the snowball would roll downhill, collecting more and more and more cookies, and we'd look at the end and we would have the largest amount. What instead happens is you have this sort of up and down. You gain some cookies, you lose some cookies as you go through to new ones, but we're interested in the final value. How many do we have in total? The reason also why we're doing that crawling is that it sort of optimizes that thing of representativeness of real world behaviors. Looking at some of the data, we can see that there's sort of like a mean or median value at about 6.1, 6.2 pages visited per website. So we do the 1 landing page, 5 additional, we've hit 5 pages in total. And we sort of see, if we look at the data as well behind it, data-wise, we hit a plateau of the number of cookies at around about 3-4 page loads. You've hit a very hard plateau at about 10. You don't tend to see any new unique cookies. So we're both quite complete and exhaustive with the data and representative of the real world behavior. Then we've got various different ways that we can sort of slice and analyze that data. For interest, this is kind of what the data set looks like at the end. It does go on further than this, so I just can't fit it on one slide. But then what we have in a whole set of columns further off to the right are the number of cookies stored. But this is sort of what we end up with. So a few things I can explain here. So all of this side is manually generated. So where we're looking at viable, I went through 1,000 websites and looked at them to see what exists on all these different things. So the first thing we have here is the idea of forced consent. So what is forced consent? Sounds like a horrible contradiction in terms, because frankly, I think it is. It sounds like a very weird thing for a website to be doing. But what we're looking at here is on websites which offer no toggles of any kind, do they present you with some kind of a statement which says words to the effect of remaining on this website constitutes consent for personalization? That's not lawful, as we've sort of figured out earlier from those things like Recital 32, which says inactivity or remaining on a website does not constitute consent. That's just not valid. but it's interesting to record it. So if we record a Y in that column and we see that more data is being collected than those which say N, ones which don't state that they're collecting your data based on you remaining on the website, there's a greater amount of data collected, we've got a concern. We start to see that GDPR may not be as forceful as we would hope. We then look to see if we're able to toggle consent, if we have those default unchecked things in there that we're able to click on. We look to see if legitimate interest is in the terms and conditions document. Bit of context around this is what I did was go through 3 of the documents. So it was the privacy policy, cookie policy if it existed, and the terms of service, looking for the word legitimate. Reason I didn't do legitimate interest is because you get a lot of permutations of it, things like legitimate business interests, legitimate purposes and interests. There's quite a lot of them, so you would end up with a sort of like false negative if you're doing it based on the precise term legitimate interest. You end up with relatively few false positives in the other direction. So people tend not to use the word legitimate in context other than legitimate interest within the terms. I do completely accept that there is likely to be some degree of conceptual slippage in both directions there, but a relatively small amount. The other thing to be aware of is not all of these websites are sort of British or European. Some are in foreign languages, for which I've used Google Translate. I might be missing the word legitimate every now and then. Should be relatively robust, but not entirely perfect. The next column, are we able to object to legitimate interest? So is it in the terms, but then do we have a toggle for it? Might be that sometimes it says it's being used, but we don't have a toggle. The IAB TCF vendors are those ones which you saw on Merriam-Webster when James and I went over to the vendors tab. And are these on by default? This isn't something I've experimented with, but I think it's interesting from a future perspective. Geographical attributes are essentially stored because they can be interesting for other things as well. So principal territory is determined based on, there's a number of ways which I've tried to infer that. So it could be if the website clearly has an address listed. It could be that there's something on a website like Crunchbase, which is a business information site, maybe on their LinkedIn, or for a lot of websites based in China, they have something called an ICP license, which I sort of regard as a single authoritative source to say that, yes, this is a Chinese website. But then we can start to say, are websites, are organizations which are based out of the EU or UK any more or less compliant than those which are based in the EU and UK? What we would hope is that there isn't a difference, because GDPR is essentially what we'd call extraterritorial. What it's there for is to protect the data subject, provided that data subject is from the EU or UK. It doesn't matter where the data collecting or processing organization lies, but we might find a difference. If we do, that might be interesting. There's a number of websites that have been rejected as well for different reasons: adult content, not loading, geo-blocked, copyright infringement, duplicates, different things essentially to protect me as a researcher if I think there's potential like legal ramification, particularly if I'm letting a crawler go loose on these websites. Then they end up in these sort of different experimental buckets. It's pretty sort of clear where those would go. We have the bucket of websites where we and legitimate interest toggles. We have ones with consent only, a bucket for those with domains. That's where within the data set, we have a whole load of things like google.com, google.co.uk, google.com.hk, like you can see on rank 30 there. And we can start to see if they operate differently. The interesting thing out of those being that it could say, do we actually see a real world observation of the Brussels effect? What the Brussels effect essentially says, it's a concept created by a researcher called Anu Bradford, who posits that people are likely to follow European law like the GDPR because it is the most strict law out there. It's easiest to default to the strictest and do one thing than to say, well, we'll have 20 permutations of how our business operates so that we can exercise a degree of additional flexibility in different places where it's not necessary. And we could see, well, if you look at google.com.hk, well, Google's not a European organization. The data subjects they're dealing with aren't based in the EU or UK. They don't need to be compliant, but are they compliant nonetheless? Are they following it just because it seems to be the most viable thing for Google to do? Despite the fact that they could be a bit more flexible and collect a bit more data, it's easier just to have one blanket rule. So what did we find? I guess this is the sort of big punchline to the end of all of this. So the first research question is, how common was the invocation of legitimate interest as a basis for processing? We find unusual results here, frankly. Of all of the websites, so it's not quite 1,000 that we've gone through here, as there were certain websites rejected. But we found around 7.2% of websites offered objection toggles out of the total that was surveyed in this way. However, by looking at the terms and conditions document, we found 57% roughly include legitimate interest in their terms. So what does this mean? How many websites are collecting that data? The real question is, like, is that data in the terms and conditions in any way accurate? I believe not. I think the policy documents are unreliable, particularly because we find that a high degree of websites that sort of irrefutably are using the legitimate interest basis for toggles, those 7.2% that have the toggles, a large proportion of them don't include legitimate interest as a statement in their terms. We know they're using it, they don't say it in the terms. What I would posit is the most likely reason behind this, but it's more a piece of further research. It needs its own sort of investigation to prove it. But I would suspect that the majority of websites are basically looking online for a privacy policy template. They are then changing a few choice words, essentially organization name, but those sort of things about what basis of processing they're using, the finer details of what they're doing with data, I don't think they're changing. Therefore, these documents are inaccurate. It's much more likely that the invocation is around about that 7.2%, though it may be slightly higher. It may be that some are using it without offering toggles, but it's unlikely to be as high as 57%.
So Ben, just to dive in, we've got just under 15 minutes left, so I just want to kind of give a little time check, and if we've got a couple of questions, by the way, if we want to kind of.
I'll be quick.
Okay. I see the results slide has gone up there now, so that's good. So we're obviously in the final.
I won't go on for too much longer. But what do we find happens? So these are the different conditions that you have under legitimate interest. You could accept and not object. You could accept and object. You could reject, consent and not object to the legitimate interest. You could try to do the maximal thing to reduce the amount of data being collected. What we find is that by objecting alone, we get a 13.1% decrease in the amount of cookies collected, but this isn't statistically significant. If you're not familiar with that statement, what we mean there is when we look at the difference in average values, that difference in averages, there's a possibility that we've observed that due to random chance, that the website's falling into different groups. It was just a random chance that happened there, and that possibility of it being a random chance is too high for us to accept that it's statistically significant. Generally, it has to be a 5% or less chance of it being a random chance that caused that to happen. We don't achieve that with legitimate interest. Rejecting consent alone achieves that reduction. It receives a 61% reduction. We do get a slightly higher reduction if we both reject and don't reject and object. We get it down by about another 0.5, 0.6%, but it's barely any higher. From a consent basis, so we have the websites that only offer us consent toggles. By rejecting consent, we achieve a roughly 43% reduction in cookies. So what we notice is it's a lower amount than we achieve through rejecting when we're on legitimate interest websites. And in fact, under all conditions, we find less data being collected on consent websites. But we don't have those toggles offered. If we look at the websites that have no toggles, this is the largest degree of websites. Slightly over 50% of them don't have toggles. About 14% of them have that sort of forced consent notice on them. What we find is that they act like websites where consent has been rejected. This is a good result. This is something which gives us confidence that the GDPR is behaving in the way that we want. That it means if we've not been offered any ability to configure consent or legitimate interest, it doesn't seem to be that anything is happening. Beyond that as well, we also find the ones with forced consent don't collect more data. I mean, there is a difference in means. The average amount of data collected is higher, but again, it's not statistically significant. It's possible that we would find that there is a statistically significant amount of data collected, which is different if we had a larger number of experimental websites. When we're talking about say 800 and something websites that have not been rejected, of which 50%, 400 have no toggles, of which 14%, so what's that, 40 odd websites which state forced consent within them. We don't have the biggest data set to be able to get statistically significant results. So it might emerge if we had a larger data set. So the good things, it does look like GDPR is working as we have intended. It does seem as though that when you don't give your consent to data being processed, that it also bundles in with that the objection under the legitimate interest basis. Really good thing there being that we don't have that concern about cookie fatigue. So where people are already annoyed at having to click accept all or reject all on all these different websites, you could imagine how that's doubly, triply, quadruply annoying if you're going through that process that James and I did at the start with Merriam-Webster. That's a really good result. But it does appear that some degree of processing is still happening even when we both don't consent and reject. So that result that we had much earlier in the sort of the literature, where we saw that 92% of websites roughly still conducted a degree of processing, it seems as though that is still the truth even when you're objecting to legitimate interest. I've not investigated that exhaustively. It seems that when you look at the JSON files listing all the cookies, it's possible to do this with the data set. Wasn't in the scope of my thesis. Just very quickly, I think there's some interesting future research to do on this. I think it could be quite easily repeated by moving a VPN location into, say, the USA and seeing if those American websites, when you're in the USA, are equally compliant. That would offer a very strong indication of the Brussels effect, which outside of this project has never been quantified. I have slightly quantified it, but I've not gone into those results in this presentation. Also, privacy policies, I think there's probably an interesting bit of work to do on the accuracy of them. If they happen to have a high degree of lexical similarity between them, and if we can link those to a few online templates, I think that would be interesting. So that is all.